is Matt Schlapp, along with Ian Walters, and welcome to our second show of CPAC Live. We had a lot of fun on Monday at 11:30, and so here's our second attempt to have the CPAC family reconnect, be able to talk to each other within this digital platform, and talk in a little more detail about the issues that are facing the country right now. We think conservative values and principles are important now more than they ever were. And today we're going to go into a little more depth with Dr. Zuhdi Jasser, who is on the board of the American Conservative Union and is also a medical doctor, a medical professional, and someone who's been very involved in with the American Medical Association. So, Ian, what else are we going to do on the show today?
Well, it's a happy Earth Day to you, Matt Schlapp. That's a favorite holiday for conservatives. Conservatives still go to work on Earth Day, even though kids these days get the day off of school to go protest. I don't think they'll be protesting in coronavirus America for the time being.
Let's hope so. The idea that you can leave school only if you have a woke political reason, be it gun control, be it fear-mongering over environmental causes like global climate change and these other things. I always find it amazing when my kids say that there was a walkout at school. If kids walked out for any other reason, sometimes even we're seeing in our society today, maybe a religious reason, principals and deans would say, wait a minute, you have to have a note from your teacher. But if you want to walk off to protest the AR-15, seems to be just fine.
Once administrations, academic institutions allow their students to go out there and support the Second Amendment, then we can talk about letting them off for Earth Day, I suppose. But we'll talk about that after we talk to our friend about more important issues.
Awesome. And as always, you have been doing some research to have some video highlights of the moment we're in.
We'll call it a sizzle reel of sorts. I don't know if it's going to be as uplifting as we'd like it to be, but it'll be an accurate reflection of the next generation's views on the topic of climate change.
That's awesome. So within the midst of all of our concern about people's health and this outbreak of Chinese corona all over the globe, one of the things I think that are on most of our minds are how do we stay healthy? I think most of us want to be balanced and level-headed about this, but some of us have friends who are becoming infected, or God forbid, there obviously is so many tragic stories of people actually dying. So we treat this with reverence and respect. It's a real issue, but by the same token, life is filled with really frightening risks. And so we got to figure out what that balance is when it comes to the health around this moment. Then you have legitimate national security concerns about what's China's intention. How did all this start? Why are some people in the news media saying that this all started in Europe? I don't think this is Swedish corona. I think it's Chinese corona. I think the facts will bear that out. When I listen to what Secretary Mike Pompeo is saying, it sure seems like this is a Wuhan-related outbreak. We'll let the facts go where they go. But what does that mean in terms of our over-dependence and over-reliance on the communist regime in China? What does this mean in Hong Kong, Ian, something you brought up last time, where ACU was on the streets of Hong Kong with Dan Schneider, our executive director, with Gordon Chang, one of our board members, Lydia Chang, his wife, Veronica Birkenstock, another board member, Charlie Giroux and others, and then our international partners who came with us, Jay Aiba from Japan and Andrew Cooper from Australia, who are running CPACs in those countries. Does this mean that the communist government in China uses this outbreak as a way to finally crush these democracy forces in Hong Kong? That's a critical issue that we want to talk about, and the other national security implications, which I think we'll touch on the show. And then there's a question about the great American economy, which is the biggest force on the globe. I'm much more worried about an American economy in recession, then what Democrats tell us is our biggest fear, which is number one, climate change, and number two, dying of a virus. I think the concern I have is if we feel like we have to take steps so that we can optimize our health by not testing positive for Chinese corona, and if that means that our economy essentially doesn't open up again, that's a balance that I think is too weighted down on one side, obviously, and I think most people who associate us would agree.
Matt, we're represented in our audience today from all over America. Cheryl Grant is saying hello from Charlotte, North Carolina. Brittany Love out there in Boise, Idaho. Claude Purdue. Dale Bellis from Liberty Health Share is joining us this morning. Jeff Dunnett's up there in New York on Long Island. And of course, hi to Julie Woods Hill. Thanks for joining us, everyone.
Hello, everyone. We're glad you could join us. I got great feedback. I am visually impaired as a 52-year-old guy, so I can't see so well up close. But after the show, I had some great interactions with many of you. I know Dan and Tina, the Daddo down in Florida, someone who used to make sure that I stayed in shape up here on the tennis court, was listening, and so many others. And what I thought was interesting about the texts and emails I received, Ian, is that most conservatives do not like the position of being inert or locked down or a steady state. We are a lot more active than that, and being shuttered in at home is something that we're anxious about. And we also intellectually want our government decision makers to make the right decisions. And I can't tell you how many board members and other conservative people of thought who I've talked to who have really outside the box ideas of what the president should be doing or what Congress should be doing or what Fauci should be saying. And I think it's great. I think one of the reasons why we're having this show is that conservative point of view is needed more than ever.
Well, we've got somebody with us who's got some good insights on Dr. Fauci today, Matt. Hi out there to Mara Brockbank, and Julie Strauss-Levin is joining us as well. Matt, who's our guest today?
Well, Julie Strauss-Levin would have been a great guest, but
that's right.
Maybe we found somebody who is just perfect for this moment. But Dr. Zuhdi Jasser, who's going to be joining this conversation, and since I'm not the technical guy, I don't know when you're going to see his face, but I'm sure it's pretty soon. He's been a member of the board of the American Conservative Union for many years now. And as I said, he is a practicing medical doctor who has had 2 leadership positions. There's Zuhdi with the American Medical Association. And Zuhdi, you also run a very thoughtful nonprofit called the American Islamic Forum for Democracy. You've been on Fox News hundreds and probably thousands of times talking about the changes that are needed for reform within these Islamic countries. But today, that issue is always important. But really, the tip of the spear of what I think a lot of our community is worried about is when they watch TV, when they consume news in this era of Chinese corona, how do they know what's right, what's wrong? How do they separate fact from fiction?
Well, thanks, Matt, and happy birthday. It's great to be with you and Ian, and it's an honor to be on the board and always be a part of CPAC. That's a great question, and as a doc in private practice, small practice, this has been, and a primary care doc who's on the front lines treating patients, trying to keep them out of the hospital, out of the ER in this crisis. This has been a perfect storm for our small businesses, and that we're not only trying to fight this disease in the front lines of this battle, but our economics have seen a significant hit, and we'll talk about that. But you're right, the issue is information. What do we believe? What don't we believe? The left spends so much of its time gaslighting us on issues that we forget about. Even we may win the battle against the virus, but yet they want us to lose the war of healthcare with all the other diseases that we're supposed to set aside in our patients as if they don't exist, as far as heart failure, cancer, and other things, all at the expense of the gaslighting about this virus. And it's real. The virus is real. We're trying to fight it. We need to win it. We're winning this battle. The curves, as they say, the proverbial curves have been flattened, but we don't want to lose the bigger picture of not only healthcare but economics. And just like every American will weigh the opinions of doctors, be it when you get a diagnosis, God forbid, of cancer, you get 3 or 4 opinions of brilliant doctors, and yet they don't all agree. And, I was trained at Bethesda Naval Hospital and learned infectious diseases from wonderful attendings, including Dr. Fauci in the 90s. And they trained us to ask questions, to question authority, and yet go with the opinions that we felt as residents and training that we believed in, while adhering to academia and that what we believe to be true. So it almost seems as if the ability to question authority is being dismissed, and somehow protesters that are concerned about, there's 3 big areas during this crisis that we're concerned about. One is beating the virus and keeping Americans healthy. 2 is overreach of our governments, which many of the governors have tried to limit. And 3 is the economic devastation that we need to prevent. And if you deal with one and ignore the other 2, you're not a conservative, and you're ignoring sort of the balance that every family makes at their dinner table every day. When they deal with one crisis, they don't sacrifice the entire family as they make a balanced decision. And that's really how you deal with what's true and what's not. It's obvious that much of the information coming out of China, coming out of the left, is just exaggerated and gaslit. And I think with programs like this, we're able to balance it a little better. Okay,
so the first question is, Dr. Anthony Fauci is a figure of some controversy. I think in the beginning, his voice was seen as strong, steady, credible, calming. And over time, the news media has done a brilliant job, which they always do, of trying to make it look like he didn't take this corona outbreak seriously enough. And now you have this question about who's telling the president how to balance our economic interests with our health concerns. You know him, you studied under him. What should we know about Tony Fauci?
When it comes to infectious diseases, virology, immunology, understanding new diagnoses and treating them, he's the best. He's the best of the best, and is part of that healthcare establishment that's been there. And I'd want to learn infectious diseases from nobody else. But having said that, just like when you decide to go to war, the generals might make some opinions about what we should do in Afghanistan or Iraq. But our president showed that sometimes the American people might have a little different opinion from some of the military establishment of what we may want to do. And I think it's similar that, yes, his initial opinions are very important and very helpful, but the decision for America on how to deal with the virus and deal with all of our health issues, be it now the increased psychiatric illness, the dismissals of diabetes, of heart failure, of all these other things that now have taken a backseat, especially if people don't have insurance, can't pay their copays, can't pay for their meds. All these things need to be balanced. And Dr. Fauci is a great doctor, but he's not an economist. He's not a strategic planner for government. And he sometimes is appearing, and I think some of what he's recommending is a bit myopic. Yes, we should physically distance, but not at the expense of everything else. So we can't just focus on the battle at the expense of the larger war for our healthcare and for our economy.
So the question about health generally, I think lots of us have considered the state of our own health. Most times like this, if I was sitting around my outdoor fire pit, I would be smoking a cigar. And during this course, I've stopped doing that because of the impact of our functionality of our lungs that we've all been watching and reading about. But maybe other people have done other things. But what you realize, the more you study, and you're a medical professional here, Zuhdi, so you got to set me straight. But it seems like the more you read about what you should do, you also read about a contrary medical view that believes that that's actually not right. Are eggs good for you or are they bad for you? Should you eat the yolk? Should you eat the whites? Is it good to have a glass of wine at night or is that bad? Is it, all these questions constantly get thrust before us. And it seems like even medical professionals have disagreements. Why would Chinese corona be any different?
That is a great question. And that's what I find myself just so separated from reality. And that as you watch the media discuss this and you watch the bandwidth that's soaked up in this conversation, it's as if we've all become experts in a novel virus. Most of the curves that they look at, be it for influenza, et cetera, we talk about morbidity, mortality, and we don't even know what the denominator is. Many studies have shown random sampling up to 50% of the population already has been exposed and infected, and most people are asymptomatic, and all this data is sort of rushing in, and that's why these models keep changing every 4 or 5 days. So the experts aren't even experts on the new virus, and Americans are very good at sometimes even things that are FDA approved. We say, you know what, maybe the FDA needs to relook at that. Maybe we need to look at alternative therapies that might be just as effective. So it's almost as if the leading country in the world that leads in medical innovation and healthcare has lost its wherewithal of questioning authority, which is what my podcast was on this week on Reform This. It was how to question authority. That's the most important skill set.
Zuhdi, I want to put you right on the spot.
Yes.
Is there anything that's come out of the administration or these healthcare professionals in the alphabet soup agencies in Washington? What would be if there's been an example of something that you would take issue with, what would it be?
I would take issue with the complete lockdowns after 2 or 3 weeks, because remember, we are 2 weeks behind people getting symptoms, and then 2 weeks later they get sick in the ICU, so we're 4 weeks behind. I felt that 4-week lag, and then sort of saying that somehow we're responsible for every life that gets lost once we undo the lockdown. As an American citizen, as a small business provider, and as a healthcare provider, I resent the government making decisions where all of a sudden I can't even tell my patients they can go to work, or I can't go to work, or my kids are locked down. So some of this of healthcare being about freedom, we've abandoned and forced people into almost a police state approach rather than them deciding on their own through heavy recommendations from government versus coercion. So I think that the lockdown approach has been extended too long, and we sort of need to realize that we will make mistakes, but I think an all or none binary approach has been my biggest complaint.
So the president seems to be the loudest voice towards a responsible reopening of the government. You have people like Steve Moore leading the charge from a free market standpoint, that a free economy that's vigorous and operating, but yet taking health precautions is critical to the overall health of the country as well. You have Jenny Beth Martin at the Tea Party Patriots rounding up activists on that point of view as well. But then you have these blue state governors that seem to be chastising the president, setting the stage that when the economy begins to resemble its previous vigorous aspects, somehow the president will be responsible for being irresponsible by opening up too soon. This seems to be the political moment we're in. This is the big setup that's coming and could be what determines who wins in November.
Yes, and did Ian, were you going to address that, or did you want me to, Matt?
That's at you, Zuhdi, but let's let Ian chime in as well.
No, that's okay, Zuhdi. Look, it does speak to the moment. So much of, I think, what the Democrat response here has to do with leveraging the moment in November. It's no secret there are a lot of progressive folks who wanted to get the new Green New Deal passed, which was really just an economic cover-up, masked as environmentalism, but it was to turn it into a socialist nation, a socialist economy. And I think that they're ready to seize the moment here. I think there's nothing they like to see more than people being dependent on the government, whether that's getting your $1,200, $2,400 checks. This is a progressive and socialist dream that's happening right now.
Yeah, and I think, for somebody who has been against entitlement programs as a rule and more of the conservative free market philosophy, this is one time in which I, as a small business owner, government made us shut down, so they need to help me out of this. It really makes sense. That whole dogma is a little different in this equation where the government forced us to avoid going to work. But having said that, the politicization of this for the ends justifying the means of the left for November politics, as you said, is really absurd. And and I think Americans are going to see that this is being exploited for political reasons. They're seeing their paychecks vanish because certain governors are unwilling and they want to blame the president and rather than blame China and look at the novel aspects of this virus and say, he did the best job possible for not only for a commander-in-chief, for a leader of our government that is dealing with a novel pandemic and got bad information from China and elsewhere. So I think, he's done the best possible and now is convening a diverse coalition to lead a healthcare response that's not only the virologists and the epidemiologists, but includes economists and others so that we can get this country back going again.
Zuhdi, I have a question here from Judy Karanika, who asks online, our mayor keeps saying we haven't hit our peak. How can he possibly know that? What is the factual basis of quantifying a peak?
Yeah, the people that are the doomsdayers, as I've called them, really have the best of both worlds. If they're wrong, they say, look, our locking you down is what caused this to be wrong. And if they're right, they say, look, we told you everybody was going to die. So it's almost as if the doomsdayer phenomena causes them to be always right. And I have to tell you, we need to take the offense, not only as free market people, but as people that care about every life, not just the COVID lives, but the non-COVID illnesses that need to start having a voice, the cancers that are getting delayed because there's no elective surgery. Primary and secondary cancers are not being operated on. They're being called elective. That's going to cause a significant morbidity and mortality. I've had patients needing defibrillators that I've had to argue for, and they're being delayed to July that may have a arrest, and it's almost turned into Canadian or NHS type socialized medicine where they're going to die waiting for these procedures. So I have to tell you, as a medical ethicist, I don't have too much love loss for those who care just about the COVID lives instead of all the lives that are being affected. And I think the mayors need to get some pushback and get on the defense rather than us who want to open the economy simply being on the defense.
One more question for you, Zuhdi, before we let you go. Thank you for your time. This comes from Kyle Inan, who asks, what would we do if a second strain of virus is in our future?
We do what we did after H1N1, after the MERS virus, et cetera. We will deal with the data as we get it. And vaccines will probably need to be renewed every year. But remember, the vaccine helps build immunity so that you don't have to get the illness. Right now, studies have shown over half the population developed immunity in the UK. Some studies in LA have shown that recently, just a few days ago. So basically, we are going to get immune. All you're doing by physical distancing is delaying the immunity. You can't beat the virus by simply separating. You're going to just delay your immunity. So we need to get up and get going to get that immunity. And the studies have shown that the severe illness is a fraction of a percent rather than because they've been exaggerating or minimizing the denominator. So the percentage mortalities are higher than really thought to be. And the numbers are now looking more like the regular influenza from a virus that just has sometimes far more criticality, but still the end numbers are not much different than the flu.
Zuhdi, let me, I think I'm back connected here. Let me just say, one of the things I've been reading on Twitter is a lot of criticism from what do you want to call it, the hateful left, about statements that I made when we had this patient at CPAC, and that it seemed like the CPAC experience was that when 10,000 people came together in a sweaty ballroom, we didn't have an outbreak. And to me, I meant that not as a way to minimize Chinese corona, but as a way to say, well, that is a hopeful sign that it doesn't mean that everybody's going to get it. It doesn't mean everyone's going to die from it. Having that kind of balance to the thinking seems like it's very important. And what you're saying, it sounds to me with my non-medical ears, is someone like myself, I could be selfish for a minute here, could have been exposed to it, either didn't get it or didn't get sick from getting it, and I might even have antibodies to beat it. Did we lose you there, Zuhdi? Ian, can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay.
Can you hear us?
We lost our medical professional.
I can hear you, Ian, but I can't see Matt anymore.
Okay. Matt's asking about, I think a lot of these reports that have come over the transom earlier this week, saying that there may have been a high level of infected, especially out there on the West Coast where you are, before anybody knew that there was a Chinese virus over here in the United States. Do you think that there's any truth to that, and that all of us who have been at CPAC together, we obviously had someone there who was infected with coronavirus that we learned, that we announced to everybody a week after the event concluded. Could we have all had it? Have we all built up antibodies at this point? Is that possible?
Very much so. If you look even in Wuhan right now, it's basically the evolution of the peak down to now return to normalcy, despite all the false information China has given us. It pretty much looks like they're getting back to normal, and that's at a peak duration of 4 to 5 months. So the time patient zero out of that lab was probably November 17. Wuhan saw the peak of their virus infection in December, January, and then the rest of the world started to see it in late December into January and February. So there's no doubt that some of the earliest infections in the U.S. had to have been early January, if not late December. So our evolution, it looks like the one thing that's very unique about this virus is that it's very contagious. It seems to spread through populations despite distancing and other issues. Sweden, Denmark, some of the countries that did not rigorously lock down people severely still did fine. So it's almost like the numbers did not change much, regardless of the severity of the lockdown. Some lockdown was required, but ultimately that 3 to 4 month period it looks like what we're finding.
And one last question before we let you go. Are you continuing to tend to all of your patients in person, or have you shifted over to digital consultations and treatment plans?
That's probably one of the few silver linings of this process. As a primary care doc, we've been able to transition, thanks to a lot of the work of the AMA and other organizations, to quickly get CMS to fund telehealth, which they never would before. And now they're paying us for telehealth. Probably half of my visits now are done on either Zoom, FaceTime, or Google Duo, or one of the platforms. So yes, it's allowed us to continue care, to get paid for it using telehealth. Before we couldn't. And now many of the patients can get continuity of care without having to physically come to the office. And we're having to screen patients that come in so that we don't have any moderate risk patients even within our doors.
Dr. Jasser, thank you for joining us. All of our CPAC friends, be sure to listen to Reform This podcast with Dr. Zuhdi Jasser. Follow him on Twitter. He's one of our friends and one of the people in America that we trust a great deal on lots of issues, not just medicine, but also on Middle Eastern relations and the threat of Islamic terrorism. Thank you so much, Dr.
Thank you, Zuhdi.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Thanks for doing this.
Run a quick videotape for you guys now to celebrate Earth Day. Annabelle, as Warner Wolf would say, let's go to the videotape.
Adults keep saying we owe it to the young people to give them hope. But I don't want your hope. I don't want you to be hopeful. I want you to panic.
We have been polluting the earth for years, and we might actually die in a few years. Our world is already in flames. It's getting hotter. We can't breathe. We are here because our parents trashed the planet, and it's up to our generation to save it.
Unlike so many people my age, I feel really visceral anxiety about climate change.
Call us Generation Z, the last letter of the alphabet, because we are going to be the last generation to survive.
My conscience couldn't handle the idea of bringing someone into a dying world.
I'm angry because this planet is dying, and the president of the biggest country in the world refuses to acknowledge that.
And I'm sick of the future that they put on us.
I am here for the people who are suffering and dying because of our country's decision.
People are suffering. People are dying. Entire ecosystems are collapsing.
Our oceans are choking with trash, and the 6th mass extinction is well underway.
We do not have time to be polite. This is a revolution.
It doesn't matter how much we're taxed if we don't have an earth to live on.
We need to do more instead of having a corrupt president who won't acknowledge that the earth is literally dying.
This is environmental racism, and we must acknowledge the issue.
We need to listen to our children because they totally get it.
Because every day of inaction drives more action from us!
You have have stolen my dreams and my childhood with your empty words. And yet, I'm one of the lucky ones. Lucky ones.
Wow.
There weren't any Schlapp children in that.
I was going to ask if there's a Walters child in there. I'm going to give you some harsh words. I think what that look, it's they're almost mocking themselves, but this is actually pretty tragic. I believe this is the result of an education system that is just way off the tracks. I mean, we're talking about a moment when school is canceled and a lot of public school systems are not competent enough to actually do online learning, like here in Fairfax County, where the system has crashed 2 or 3 times in a $2 or $3 billion budget. They can't seem to practice online learning in a competent way. And the other problem is too many times in both private and public schools, they are competently teaching our children and grandchildren to be leftists, to hate America, to get us diverted from our true threats. I mean, a nation knowing what its true threats are is probably the most critical aspect of its survival. And if we allow these people to bamboozle the next generation of voters into thinking that we shouldn't fight pollution, but we should fight the amount of CO2 going into the atmosphere, that means we'll have a dirtier planet, dirtier air, dirtier water. America will make nothing anymore, which is, we've already seen the outgrowth of taking our manufacturing assets under the 8 years of Obama and making sure they're all in places like China. We got to make sure we get these kids back. It's like a revisitation of the 1960s, which you're too young to understand, Ian, is not a positive thing.
No, we rioting in the streets, a lot of social unrest. I'm going to give you a comment and a question from our CPAC audience, Matt, before you take us home. Joshua Paget writes, CPAC 2020 was an epic and incredible event. Patriotic freedom at its all-time greatest. We're going to get back to that by next year. I assure you guys, we're going to be hanging out with each other in person again. But first, before I let you go, Matt Schlapp, thanks for joining us. This question comes from Brittany Love. First off, I think you are amazing, Matt Schlapp. Second, I was just wondering how you feel about the stay-at-home orders. Do you think we are doing more harm than good? At what point do you think we are going to reopen the city? I am from Boise, Idaho, and we are already protesting the stay-at-home order. I believe every business is essential.
So I'm going to ask Jonathan, my colleague here, to hand me that black and white photo, because Mercy and I were talking just yesterday. I got this photo in the mail. This is backstage at CPAC. So this was Joshua's question. This is backstage. We're having a great conversation. Your mother, Millie, joined this conversation soon thereafter. And Mercy looked at me and said, it feels like that was a lifetime ago. A lifetime ago, the things we were talking about, the president, Corona was being discussed as a problem, but it just feels like we're in a whole different place. And that's the nature of living in a dynamic world. And what I would say about whether or not I agree or disagree with some of these policies, I would say this. The number one reason I'm a conservative is not because I took a pledge or an oath, or I got elected into some kind of secret society, or was included into the club. I'm a conservative because in my 50 plus years on this earth, I believe that it's critically important that we have a practical understanding of the human condition. And I believe so deeply that God set up a system on this earth, in this solar system, in this universe, right, where there are certain realities to things. And he helps us by giving us virtues and gifts, but he also expects us to solve some puzzles and some problems and to use those gifts. And I think that's the beautiful thing about the human condition. So Chinese Corona presents us with this terrible reality we'd like to ignore, which is people are getting sick and people are dying. But then we have to take a step back and say, how do you balance it? So I'd look at what Zuhdi said about the president and say that I think he's really hit the right marks. There are words and things that he has used that maybe some of us would say things differently in our own unique way. But what has come across to me is that this man who learned how business works, and his business is the business of making people happy in very tall buildings, and in resorts and on golf courses and all these questions around the globe. He's learned that in order to be successful, he has to satisfy customers so they want to come back, and that you don't get to choose the problems that are before you. Sometimes problems just come. And he would understand this as a man who owns hotels and resorts that are all closed, all shut down, that this stinks. But yet you have to take certain steps you don't want to take. So as conservatives, we hate the idea of the government spending trillions of dollars in wealth transfer to give to businesses. But I agree with what Zuhdi said. It's the government that shut down Zuhdi's medical practice by and large weeks ago. And that's an economic taking. And when there's an economic taking as conservatives, we got to make sure that the government is held accountable to come up with an economic settlement for those people. So I think this is not like the financial crisis of 2008 and 2009 when banks were bailed out and such. I think this is actually an economic taking by the government. That being said, there's got to be a balance to how much they are able to take. Because if you listen to mostly blue state leaders, mayors, and governors, we can't reopen until the threat of getting sick is minimal. Well, my friends, we're never going to get there. We have never gotten there. There's always threats with being out in society. And what we try to do is take the best medical advice to have a balance. But, the business of America is business. We were meant to deal with each other. There are periods of time when we might have to have a more digital existence, but I'd like that to be as shallow as possible. And then finally, what like the governor of Kansas is doing, basically making it a higher bar for people of faith in what they want to do outside their homes is repugnant. Going to church is not more dangerous than going to Planned Parenthood. Yet for blue state governors, going to Planned Parenthood is critical. Praying even in a way that's safe, following all the guidelines, is somehow a threat to the rest of us. This is when the country gets out of balance. And this is when we have to push back. And this is where these groups that I mentioned earlier in our conversation, and including the ACU, and we're just all of you, our role is to make sure that government doesn't take our rights unnecessarily, never illegally, and that there's a proper and appropriate pushback. And what I fear the most out of all this is the silencing of people who have a contrary point of view. I think we will solve many of our problems if we have more voices that are expressing their point of view on what the nation should do. Our nation is great because it's grappled with big, huge problems and come to resolution. If those folks that have a different point of view are silenced because we're told that even expressing the point of view will cause a health pandemic, like Facebook is apparently doing, shutting down voices that might have a contrary view to what the liberal governor of Kansas wants to do, or the liberal governor of Michigan wants to do, or what our horrible, racist, black-faced, Klan robe-wearing governor of the Commonwealth of Virginia wants to do, then that is, in essence, that is ceasing a functioning democracy. And we've got to make sure that doesn't happen.
Matt Schlapp, we'll see you again on Friday at 11:30. Can you help us get the Constitution out of quarantine? Let's get the Constitution out of lockdown, man.
And I'm sorry about some of these technical issues, but we are running 5 schools out of the Schlapp household, and my wife is working for this small re-election campaign, which is taking some of the bandwidth here as well. So there's a lot of juggling going on here, but we really appreciate y'all joining us. And Ian, thanks for all your work you're doing and the team is doing to pull us together. We're going to keep it going.
Let's do it. Thanks, Grizzly Joe. Thanks, Barbara Bowie Whitman. And we'll see the rest of you guys on Friday at 11:30 a.m. for the next edition.